South Korea is dismantling loudspeakers directed toward North Korea. We cover this and more in Press Perspective today. Welcome to Wednesday's edition of Press Perspective. It's August 6th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. The Lee Jae Myung administration is seeking a peaceful approach to stability on the Korean Peninsula. That being said, in our panel session today, we address the prospects of this policy. For this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have Cheon Soram, a former reporter with Radio Free Asia, with us. Soram, it's been a while. It's great to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Right, Thomas, we shall start with you. Let's begin with South Korea's dismantling of loudspeakers directed toward North Korea. You covered this for the UPI. Tell us a bit about your coverage and, of course, your takeaways.
Yes, so it started on Monday. They began dismantling these loudspeakers that have been set up along the border inside the DMZ that had been broadcasting kind of anti-Pyongyang propaganda, I guess you could say, or, you know, it was K-pop and news from South Korea and, you know, maybe messages to people in North Korea that might be hearing about life in South Korea. And so the military started taking them down on Monday, and they finished today, actually, they announced. You know, this actually follows on the administration of President Lee Jae Myung's approach to North Korea, this, you know, these efforts to improve relations, or at the very least kind of take down the temperature for now. So Lee Jae Myung had actually ordered the suspension of the broadcasts, you know, the broadcasts from these speakers in June. So this was just kind of finishing up the job, I guess, or doing it more in a more permanent way. And you know, these had restarted about a year prior under the previous Yoon administration. And, you know, they had kind of come in response. There was this back and forth, as I'm sure you recall, covering at the time, of North Korea sending these trash-filled balloons over the border. And so South Korea started these speakers up again, but, you know, they've been used over decades, I think, really. So, you know, there was this border tension going on that was kind of, you know, at points getting sort of seemingly quite serious. So I think Lee Jae Myung's approach since, you know, starting the administration has been to try and, you know, lower the temperature in these kind of immediate ways. I mean, he's also, you know, the South repatriated some North Korean citizens last month that had been found on boats, you know, that crossed the border, and actually even attempted to contact, you know, they've been reaching out to North Korea to try and reestablish communications, and they had yesterday had said that they wanted to repatriate the remains of a body that was also found on an island in the Yellow Sea or the West Sea of a North Korean citizen, and were requesting, you know, the North to respond. And so basically the North has really not taken the bait or responded to much of these overtures by South Korea. I mean, they did cease their own speaker broadcasts when the South had cut off the propaganda broadcasts. The North had been broadcasting like animal screeches and weird noises, and they did stop that. And they've done a couple of, you know, maybe reciprocal things like that, although they haven't removed their loudspeakers yet. The military has said that. But in general, you know, Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, just last week made a statement in the official state press, basically saying, you know, we have no interest in reconciling or discussing anything with the South, and, you know, the Lee Jae Myung administration is more or less the same as Yoon. You know, they're still tied to the U.S. militarily, so, you know, that's been their response so far.
Right, and meanwhile, speaking about the suspension of broadcasts, Soram, the National Intelligence Service has also suspended its decades long radio and television broadcast targeting North Korea. For the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with that, could you tell us a bit about the history of those broadcasts by the National Intelligence Service, as well as its recent suspension and, of course, the response to this?
So the history of those radio and TV broadcasts go back decades. South Korea's intelligence agency has been running these broadcasts into North Korea over 50 years. Radio transmissions to North Korea began during the Korean War, initially led by the US, and then in 1970s, South Korea took over and operated ever since. So it's over 50 years of history for South Korea's side. South Korea used this broadcast to send global news, testimonies from defectors, and popular dramas, and even K-pop music into North Korea. And the goal was to offer a rare glimpse of life outside North Korea and beyond their tightly controlled information bubble. Then in July, South Korea's National Intelligence Service, or NIS, suspended all radio and TV into North Korea just weeks after Lee Jong-seok was appointed as chief of NIS by President Lee Jae Myung. Over the years, South Korea's loudspeakers were turned on and off depending on the political situation. But unlike them, radio and TV broadcasts had continued without interruption for more than 50 years until now. The decision faced criticism for North Korean human rights advocates. They warned that it could make it even harder for ordinary North Koreans to access information from outside. And for many people living near the border, radio had been one of the few lifelines to gain outside information. And now signal is gone without explanation. Interestingly, officials confirmed that shortly after South Korea stopped the broadcast, North Korea stopped jamming signals on most frequencies that used to distract South Korea's radio signals. The number of jamming channels dropped from 10 to 2 or 3, suggesting that Pyongyang may be responding its own way, even if it's not publicly.
Right. And against the backdrop of these efforts by South Korea to re-engage North Korea, your agency, UPI, Thomas, recently published a piece including the thoughts of pundits with regard to what was called a one-sided courtship of North Korea by South Korea. Could you walk us through the concerns that were shared?
Yes, so this was just an opinion piece written by someone, No-seok Choi, used to former chief editor of the Gyeongyang Shinmun here. So these are his opinion, his words, but basically he was actually basing it, responding to this NIS ending these radio TV signal broadcasts. That was kind of the impetus for it, and making the argument that this administration's policy towards North Korea is in danger of maybe giving away too much unilaterally. And I think he kind of praised the idea of stopping the broadcasts and seeing the propaganda loudspeakers, and there was some reciprocity from the North about that. But then I think he was mostly arguing that there's something, you may actually be losing something valuable through these radio broadcasts. That's like, are you giving up too much in this effort to kind of ameliorate the relationship with the North or make nice? And so it's obviously a question I think is worth looking at, but it certainly reflects an ongoing debate, I think, that's also gone on for decades, really, about how to engage with the North, where I was here during the period of the Moon Jae-in administration, and that time, and there were criticisms not only from kind of the conservative or right wing saying, oh, you shouldn't be trying to talk with Kim Jong-un, we shouldn't be trying to, negotiate with them, but also from sort of human rights activists, et cetera, saying, you're not, you're giving away too much, or you're not demanding enough in terms of concessions about issues like human rights or things that, this idea, I think, was that we have to give North Korea as much as possible to get them to the table. And that's been kind of an ongoing push and pull throughout. And I think so now we're seeing this reemerge again. And, and the wild card really, though, is what's Washington going to do in the middle of this? I would note that, the Trump administration has done probably, even maybe a greater, step towards dismantling this information flow into the North by defunding Radio Free Asia, Soram's former, and Voice of America. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of that, not just within North Korea, but in other sort of totalitarian regimes. And so I think there's, this question has been floating around whether Trump is going to have another summit with Kim Jong-un, in this sense of what is he, what would possibly be on the table and what concessions could be made. So, that's a question that exists, domestically, but also I think the Washington factor is going to play a large role in, how this goes forward as well.
Right, for sure, which is what quite a number of pundits have been saying, of course. And in the meantime, Soram, North Korea, for its part, has been adamant, as Thomas mentioned earlier, adamant about its animosity with regard to the alliance between South Korea and the US. Do remind us a bit about what North Korea's Kim Yo-jong, that's Kim Jong-un's sister, said, which some people claim is her remarks were playing nice with the US while quite tough with South Korea. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Kim Yo-jong recently issued what some experts call a twin warning to both Seoul and Washington. On one hand, she rejected South Korea's gesture, accusing President Lee Jae Myung's leadership for blindly trusting U.S. alliance and maintaining the same hostile position as previous leader. She said, "We have no interest in any proposal from Seoul, and there is neither reason nor issue to meet." At the same time, her tone towards U.S. Was unexpectedly more measured. She noted that Kim Jong-un's personal relationship with President Trump is not bad, but quickly added that any expectation of denuclearization of North Korea would be a mockery. She insisted that U.S. must accept North Korea as a nuclear state before dialogue. This dual message can be interpreted two ways. Some see this as strategic attempts to drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington, widening the differences. And others say she's softening the tone towards the U.S. while scorning like South Korea, signaling potential interest in U.S. engagement under strict terms, although she dismisses South Korean diplomacy completely. In essence, Kim Yo-jong remains hostile towards South Korea, firmly rejecting its peace gesture. At the same time, she's keeping diplomatic channels with the U.S. open, but only on North Korea's nuclear terms. So her remarks can serve as both a warning to Seoul and an olive branch to Washington, depending on how one reads it.
Right, and staying with security here on the Korean Peninsula, Thomas, amid much speculation about the fate of American soldiers stationed here in South Korea, UPI again carried an opinion piece that highlighted the importance of maintaining the status quo. Could you tell us a bit about the thoughts that were shared in that opinion piece, and of course, your takeaways as a correspondent based here in this part of the world?
Right, so that was a piece by a guy named David Maxwell, who's analyst, pundit, scholar. He's a retired U.S. Army Special Forces colonel who's been based in this region for quite a while. And basically, I don't know if he was arguing for the status quo as much as arguing maintaining, a forward-facing U.S. troop presence, but he was also responding to news that's been around, and as you mentioned, this idea of potential U.S. troop drawdown or kind of positioning in the region, in response to sort of the Indo-Pacific strategy and the focus more on the China threat. And there have been specific terms for this alliance modernization is the phrase that's come out from some sources in the Pentagon and the State Department. There's been, a couple of tweets about it and some, reports in media that, is saying this is basically how the Pentagon is framing this. And this may be something that's going to come up. I don't know how much in the Trump Lee Jae Myung summit that's supposed to be happening soon. But this idea that it's out there, alliance modernization, but what I think the specifics of that is not clear. And so I think there's some concern or some sense that that may mean moving U.S. troops elsewhere in the region. But David Maxwell in this opinion piece is really saying that, yes, alliance modernization is important, and it's an idea of shifting from a kind of traditional deterrence posture to more of a regional security focus. And he's arguing that there needs to be U.S. troops here to do that, and that it would be, I think, basing them here would be vital for helping to deter aggression and support partners across the Indo-Pacific. That's kind of his argument, and calling it kind of a regional force multiplier. So he's basically saying that they should be updating the alliance, and he's talking about multi-domain operations, joint rapid response, even returning to DMZ patrols for U.S. troops. So he's kind of supporting this idea, but emphasizing that there needs to be a strong U.S. troop presence here. And he's made the argument, and I've seen some other people argue this as well. Kurt Campbell, who's the former Deputy Secretary of State in the U.S., recently at a conference mentioned this. This idea of pulling back troops, sends a signal that to the north and maybe to other adversaries in a way that could be, misinterpreted or seen as a crisis of confidence, of confidence among allies. So, there's an argument that just the symbolism of it would also be a sign you don't want to send if you want to maintain this strong alliance.
Right, and staying with this, Soram, in an interview with the Washington Post, Foreign Minister Cho Hyun, he also brushed aside concerns about a possible reduction in U.S. troop presence here on the Korean Peninsula. What exactly did he say, and what have you been hearing on the ground with regard to this particular issue?
So, in recent interview with the Washington Post, Foreign Minister Cho Hyun downplayed concerns about potential reduction in U.S. troop presence on the Korean Peninsula. He explained that there is no indication that U.S. forces will be leaving, and he said U.S. forces will remain as such, and their role will remain as of today. According to Cho, he recently met with a number of U.S. senators, and based on the conversation he had, he was assured that the reduction of the forces will not be the case. When he was asked what a potential reduction might mean for the U.S. and ROK alliance, he described the scenario as hypothetical, but also said he doesn't believe it will happen. This message was widely seen as an effort to calm any domestic concern inside of South Korea, especially with growing speculation that shifting U.S. forces toward countering China in other parts of the region. In South Korea, experts agree with Jo's reading of situation. Many viewed his remarks as both public reassurance and a signal that the U.S. and ROK alliance remain solid. With the summit between President Lee Jae Myung and President Trump is expected to come on later this month. Jo's comments may have intended to set expectations and reinforce the current alliance structure. In short, official line from Seoul is that U.S. troops not going anywhere, and the alliance remains central to South Korea's security structure.
Right, indeed, and those were the remarks by the Foreign Minister Cho Hyun. Thomas, quite a number of pundits have been talking about how the price for peace here on the Korean Peninsula is rising. What have you been hearing?
Let me add one thing to the previous discussion, just because it was something I wanted to say. From my own perspective, one thing I will be keeping an eye on is the U.S.-South Korea joint military exercise, Ulchi Freedom Shield, is happening, this month, and I think information about that is going to be coming out very, very shortly. And I think that will be an interesting, maybe, measure to see where some of these issues might be playing out in the real world. If we see some changes in the exercise,
itself.
maybe so that's just something I wanted to mention. I will be keeping an eye on. As far as to the question about the possibility of engaging with the North. I don't think anyone thinks now that it's something that is very obviously in the cards. one analyst, Robert Kelly, who's famously the BBC dad, he had a piece recently, and he was talking, basically saying that, any notion of a grand peace deal between Trump and North Korea is basically impossible, and there's just this fundamental kind of unbridgeable divide, which is that, Pyongyang has declared itself a nuclear weapon state, and as we were talking about before, Kim Yo-jong has kind of made that clear recently again, mentioning that there's just no, this any notion of approaching from a perspective of denuclearization, North Korea is instantly, rejecting and saying, you need to recognize us as a nuclear weapon state. I mean, that's how they have officially declared themselves. And so that just creates this kind of unthinkable situation, I guess, which is that, if you concede that kind of changes the whole landscape of the nuclear, non-proliferation scheme, and just, would kind of encourage states like in Iran or somebody else, to say, okay, let's just build our own nuclear weapons. If Washington's going to go around and kind of recognize us, maybe not as an official in the group of official states, but there's this kind of, de facto nuclear states like the Indias and Pakistans, and I think North Korea wants to be in that sphere. So, it's basically the idea that there's just no way to kind of bridge that gap unless, short of, as he's saying, an unthinkable concession like withdrawing all U.S. troops from South Korea. So I think, this is the position now where North Korea is, and they frankly are in a stronger position than they were the first time around when Trump, met with Kim in 2018. And so, the other arguments that I think analysts have generally made on the other side of that, or in terms of the engagement question, are more about, don't start with denuclearization, even though, Washington has recently reconfirmed its commitment to, complete denuclearization of North Korea. There's been this idea of an arms control approach as the way to start, and that comes from people like Jeffrey Lewis, Siegfried Hecker, Jenny Town. There's a number of kind of, nuclear experts that have advocated for that, and the idea is kind of risk reduction, stability, and maybe taking a slower approach, step-by-step kind of deals. But that's not, what Washington is signaling, and that's, really, I think, to be seen where South Korea wants to fall in that scale. But I think the idea that, accepting North Korea as a de facto nuclear state would also strengthen the demands, the calls here within South Korea to, perhaps get its own nuclear weapons. So it's a very fraught situation. And I think, at this point, there doesn't seem to be a really easy path forward. I mean, of course, we know Trump has, said he thinks he has a great relationship with Kim Jong-un, and it sounds like something he's wants to do. Maybe, again, we'll get some more ideas if and when Lee Jae Myung and Donald Trump meet for their summit.
Right. Well, Mr. Trump has said that they'll be holding a summit this particular month, so hopefully we'll get a better picture of the situation once their summit takes place. I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thomas, as always, thank you so much for your insights today. And Soram, thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is indeed all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow.